So tonight, we're going on a whistle-stop tour of this thing called Wicca, and one of the books that's quite well-known book is got the subtitle "A Very Modern Witchcraft." And I thought we'd explore this as a kind of a sort of historical take on some of the ideas of Wicca, and then to introduce some of you that aren't sure of what it is, with a little bit more sort of focus and a little bit more structure. And those of you that are already well clued up in it, some topics to talk about at the end of the presentation. So let's move forward. The overview, it does this all the time, sorry. There we go. I don't know, it logged me out. The overview, we're going to talk a bit about what Wicca is and isn't. We're going to look at some of the key aspects of Wicca. We're going to talk about some of the people it's worth knowing about and possibly reading about. And along the way, we'll look at the different aspects of something that's called the craft. We'll look at traditional, initiatory, and hedge traditions, just very briefly saying what they are. And we'll find out more about what witches do or what they claim to do. So that's the overview, all in about 40 minutes to go through the introductions, and then we can have our conversation at the end. One of the first things that comes to mind when I start to think of Wicca and witchcraft is all of the press that was around the pagan movement, but particularly the witchcraft movement, in the sort of 60s and 70s. Now, I was born in 1958, so I was quite young in the 60s, but when I started to get interested in this area, there was still that kind of opening out of spiritual traditions, and the newspapers were kind of starting to look at, Satanism and witchcraft, and tied it with the same feather, tied it with the same brush rather. And there was actually an element of what has been known as satanic panic in the sort of 70s and into the 80s, about people getting suckered in to this tradition, and the newspapers loved it. You've only got to sort of do a search for newspaper headlines from the 60s, 70s to do with the alternative movements, and you will find all this stuff, because the witches were running around naked and they were perverting people and all that kind of stuff. And you get headlines like, 30 people sacrificed by a satanic cult, and black magic feared to be the source of murderers in certain towns. And it really was a time when the newspapers were making a lot of headlines about something that was fear-inducing. And even today, when you mention the word witchcraft or witch, to a lot of people, certainly in Britain, they are influenced by some of these newspaper headlines that they will have seen back in the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. The idea of sacrifice to the devil. That's a Tory MP claiming that. I'm sure we can think of something witty to say back to our Tory MPs. And the fact that when the game Dungeons and Dragons came out, there was this notion that was suckering people into the dark side, and people that were playing Dungeons and Dragons had their mortal souls at risk. Mostly that stuff was spread by hysterical Christian movements who either couldn't be bothered to understand what was going on, or just wanted to recruit people to save their souls. We do know that what became known as the satanic panic, with all this stuff about Satanists sacrificing babies and causing murders, was actually something and nothing, in the sense that the media hyped a lot of this up. And we can talk, if you like, afterwards about some of the satanic scandals that were supposed to have happened in those 60s, 70s, 80s times. Not saying some of them didn't happen, but they weren't necessarily due to Satanists. And if you are a member of the group here, you know that you can go back to an episode that we did on Satanism and what that's all about. One of the things that I found out, and a lot of my contemporaries have found out, is that if they've done anything anywhere that's been associated with witchcraft, magic, uh, esoteric stuff, the newspapers, your local newspapers will find you. And they'll find you, especially at Halloween, because they want to create some kind of story around Halloween. And Sue and I, that's my partner Sue, have been spoken to the local press numerous times, partly because we run the School of Mystery Magic, and partly because when all this photograph was taken, we were doing courses in Druidry and esotericism and occultism and Wicca. And it's good news fodder. And you've only got to look at, again, do a Google search for witches in the news, and almost every year there will be a spread from some supposed experts who have been interviewed by the press to give their take on what magic and witchcraft is all about. And I know the people that interviewed us were kind of disappointed when we didn't talk about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, rock and roll maybe, but certainly not the sex and drugs, partly because my view of Wicca and witchcraft and magic isn't that kind of view. So, witches and witchcraft, there are some topics to talk about here, some of which we'll elaborate on and some of which we'll just leave in your mind. First of all, there's the witches and witchcraft that's part of myth and fable. You see a really good horror movie, or you read a fantasy story, or certainly a medieval fantasy story, you're going to find references to some kind of witches or some kind of magic or some kind of person who mixes elixirs and potions. And those witches, those which I would call the myth and fable witches, not saying they didn't exist, but they've actually been glamorized or unglamorized in some cases to present a particular view of what this is all about. We then have the sort of what we know from history. We know that there have been, in Europe anyway, there have been numerous witch persecutions and witch trials. The fact about a lot of those is that many of the people that were in the UK hung in the 1600s for being witches. They weren't burnt in England, they were burnt in Scotland, but not in England, were actually probably not witches at all of any formal sense. They were just poor unfortunates that fell foul of the social system they were in. A number of people who practice witchcraft would call themselves traditional witches, in the fact that they follow a pathway, a structure, a set of personal beliefs and approaches to life that have been handed down within their family. And they have a traditional claim to authenticity. Again, these are interesting cases because these are not necessarily the witches that we talk about when we talk about Wicca. Then the next level, if you like, we've got modern initiatory witchcraft. These are witches that have been initiated by somebody who's an experienced in the craft, and that the group structure is that they are trained and developed with some kind of structure, and it's an initiation experience. Now, that's the route that I went through when I was early into this. Sort of teenage, just over teenage years, really, early teenage, late teenage, early 20s. I was interested enough to follow this through and work with a particular tradition. And it was initiatory. So it was, first, second, third degree initiations, and each level was leading you to a different point. There's a modern movement that we can call independent, where they don't necessarily have an initiatory tradition. They have this self-initiation tradition where people come along and plow themselves to the craft. Then there's the so-called hedge tradition. And these are people who really claim old wisdom. They claim that they're doing the things the way that the ancients did, but they don't necessarily mix in groups. They don't actually necessarily attend meetings with other witches. They work on their own. I can think of at least two people in Cornwall that would call themselves hedge. They're very well known. They will work with people, but they don't pay any attention or don't even sort of, in many ways, acknowledge the traditions that have arisen as initiatory traditions. And then lastly, we need to consider the idea of witches in other cultures. It is very easy to get sucked into the idea of this being a Eurocentric thing. Talking about witchcraft in places like Africa has different sets of connectivity, different sets of, if you like, stories, myths, and traditions, but also different meanings. So, witchcraft in other cultures is possibly a very different thing to the witchcraft we're going to talk about in Europe and North America. Not saying they don't overlap, they probably do, but we've got to remember that many of these traditions that we've sanitized so we can teach them are drawn from very ancient ideas and ancient belief systems that differ from culture to culture to culture. An example that springs to mind, which isn't about witchcraft or witches, but it's to do with, most people in the West who go to New Age festivals will have come across the idea of the North American Indian medicine wheel, and they would have come across the idea of, medicine cards and works by a guy called Jamie Sands. Of course, what we're not told when we read these books is that that is one set of structures, and not all Native Americans, American Indians, actually follow the medicine wheel, as certainly Kenneth Meadows, the English writer on that sort of stuff, started to talk about. In fact, they have subtle variations on these things, which are local to their particular culture, their particular area, their particular natural context. A story I like telling is that a number of years ago, I went along to a talk by a traveling Native American person. That's the phrase that he was introduced as. He belonged to we would call them the Sioux people, but that's again an offense to call them that. He had a more defined structure that he was working to. And in this meeting, he was talking about animals and spirits and totem animals. And somebody asked him, I keep dreaming of dolphins. What do they mean? And his response was wonderful. His response was, I'm a Plains Indian. How the hell would I know? And what we've tended to do with a lot of our mystical teachings in the West is sanitize them and generalize them so they've lost the flavor of the context in which they developed. And I think the danger with modern witchcraft is that sometimes it either has lost contact with its own roots or has fallen for the myth and fable and the romantic idea of what they think or people think witches and witchcraft is. So I know there's going to be a lot there we can pick up when we have a discussion later. Wicca itself is an interesting word. It is suggested that the word Wicca actually means wise. The one spelling of the word witch comes from about the 16th century, and Wicca is Old English with both a masculine and a feminine term, which kind of meant wise or wise man, wise woman. The word wizard actually breaks down into the word wise, wiz, and ard as a state in being. So wise, state of being. In the same way, you could say somebody's a drunkard, but wise, ard, state of being. Wise woman and cunning man, they're words that are used in recent years to talk about the old traditions that people had. A wise woman is obviously a female practitioner of divination, healing, herb lore. They would be the kind of the village person that everybody would go to when they needed their donkeys to mate. No, say donkeys to mate. That'd be a bit of magic, wouldn't it? Their cows to mate, and or they needed healing, or they wanted a love spell or a love charm. and wise woman and cunning man are those kind of practitioners. They were not necessarily witches or followers of a structured belief system, but they had folk wisdom, and that's really important. Now, another Old English word for witch is agetis or getesi, which is again the male and female, which became the modern word hag and linked to the word hex. Again, those words themselves actually have emotional meanings, don't they? If you call somebody a hag, we're depicting a certain age, usually of a woman, who and therefore looks a particular way, as a particularly different being, and it's often that section of the community that was persecuted in witch trials in Europe because they were outside of that community. The word hex and hexen, more popular, I think, in the colonies. But to hex somebody is to cast a spell on somebody, usually a negative spell. I like the idea that the word Wicca means wise, and therefore people who are following Wicca are actually part of a wise craft, or they're crafty, wise people, and are skilled in different areas of social interest or where they can interact with people. Whoops. What I've tried to do here is summarize for those of you who are still not too sure the key principles that are often taught in modern Wiccan trainings or schools or traditions. And it's really difficult because each tradition will have a slight variation of these principles, but on the whole, they will be these: the divine aspects of the divine can be found in nature, and nature is reflected in the divine. Nature expresses itself through a male principle and a female principle, a god and a goddess. Again, this is a key idea. Now, where some people get lost here is that many Wiccans also believe in a divine superpower, if you like, the cosmos, the universe, that is neither God nor goddess. It is a mixture of both. And the reason the god and goddess images are important is they reflect the traditional makeup of society, male and female, active, passive, all those kind of things. Wiccan principles are about celebrating the seasons. These are times to honor, and they have traditions for each season, which are often tied to the agricultural cycle, the natural cycle of growth, death, growth, life, and rebirth. Most Wiccan teachings involve the practice of magic. If you spell it without the K, that's fine. If you spell it with the K, you're influenced by Aleister Crowley, who believes that magic with a K differentiates it from the magic that conjurers do. Most Wiccan principles are about causing no harm, which kind of makes you think about any of the early claims about witches being Satanists who therefore want to sacrifice children. It doesn't make any sense. In the fairy stories, the Grimm's fairy stories particularly, we do see these witch characters that want to drain the life out of the youth in order to give them lives. But that's the fairy story. And again, the fairy story probably symbolizes something else. We can pick that up later. So causing no harm is important. The idea of respecting yourself and others, which then negates the kind of idea that witches are there to harm other people. Again, one of the things that's often leveled against the witch movement, particularly in the 50s when it started to become back into the public consciousness. Most witches or Wiccans have a sense of karma. Now, I won't necessarily say that they have the same idea of karma as maybe the Hindus have, but they have the idea of cause and effect. That whatever you give out, you get back. It has this lovely idea of the law of threefold return. What you give out comes back to you threefold. So if you're giving out lots of good stuff, then you're looking forward to a happy time. If you're giving out loads of negative stuff, then watch out, it's going to come back to you. And then most Wiccans and most Wiccan systems of belief will have a belief in levels of reality and the existence of other worlds. Now, those other worlds may be a spirit realm, they may be an other world, a fairy realm, they may be a dream realm. Again, a lot will depend on the traditions of the particular witch, but this idea of other worlds. And I think that's a really interesting psychological area to explore. So those are some of the key Wiccan principles. Obviously, I'm not saying in a hard and fast way that's what all witches believe, but most will acknowledge, most practicing Wiccans will acknowledge those as a kind of, a fair summary of most of the things that they think about. In terms of the god and the goddess, well, the god and the goddess are both representations of nature. The god is sometimes seen as the horned god, and in more recent traditions, maybe seen as the oak or the holly god. More about that in a moment. But, ooh, I've no idea what that was, but they're trying to connect with me. The horned god, as appears on top there, that's from the Gunstrup cauldron, which is a Bronze Age cauldron showing a horned god, a god of nature, sitting there, surrounded by the animals. This cauldron is quite amazing. If you ever get a chance to see it, it was at the British Museum for a while. It may have moved on now, but this cauldron is a ritual cauldron with carvings and engravings around the outside. But the one that's interesting here is this horned god character. The horned god is often seen as a god of fertility, often seen as a god of nature. And the challenge here has been that the horned god, in terms of Wiccan movements, opened the way for people to accuse the witches of worshipping Satan, because Satan has horns. Interestingly, I don't think anywhere in the Bible it says that Satan has horns. That's a medieval invention, but it's quite interesting. Now, the female aspect, the feminine aspect, and actually this is quite interesting because today, well, if I'd have been doing this talk 15 years ago, maybe, if I'd reached no objection from anybody if I said male principle and female principle. Nowadays, we're opening up a particular can of worms by trying to talk about binary genders. And we can talk about that later, but I just think that when we talk about these, we're not necessarily talking about male and female, we're talking about aspects of activity and receptiveness. And we are both, each one of us is both of those energies, if you like. We're both active and receptive. And I think some modern Wiccan movements particularly have found their own way around understanding this in terms of LGBT plus issues. But I just think it's really interesting. Most traditional Wiccans will recognize a triple goddess, usually a moon goddess, and perceived as a mother, maiden, and crone. It's interesting that this idea of the mother, maiden, and crone cycle is reflected in the lunar cycle, which then gives you the idea that the goddess is a representation of the lunar energies, and the god is a representation of the solar energies. Maybe that's a better way to say it. But these two personifications are not necessarily meant to be seen as a strict god and a strict goddess. They're seen as essences or attributes or ways to look at the world around us. And different traditions will use different names for the gods and the goddesses. So if you're Celtic inspired in your practice, then you use the names of the Celtic goddesses and gods from myth. If you are inspired by the Greek tradition, you use Greek names for gods and goddesses. And that's the case throughout all of this stuff. We will tend to use the names for things that are linked to the tradition that we feel comfortable with. And true considerations of the goddess and the god are actually not about the name we call them. The name is the representation of the bigger energy. Okay. But anyway, that's a long and involved explanation of the god and the goddess. The oak and the holly god are interesting because they tie to the two halves of the year, the oak part of the year and the holly part of the year, where the oak grows and gives way to the holly god who grows, blossoms, blooms, gives way. And this cycle of birth and death is represented in the myths of the oak and the holly god, and indeed within the myths of the mother, maiden, and crone. So this cycles of birth, death, rebirth, cycles of birth, death, rebirth are repeated within Wiccan tradition. The next thing then is the fact that most Wiccans will acknowledge what they call the wheel of the year. And in fact, a lot of pagans will recognize the wheel of the year. Just a quick word for a moment, that pagan actually means country dweller. And the idea that pagan became a group of religious practices that should be outlawed by the church, again, is a fairly recent idea. Pagan simply means country dweller. So the wheel of the year, there are 8 phases to this wheel in the Wiccan tradition, and they move through the Yule. And now these festivals have existed at different times throughout our culture. We all know about the May Day celebrations. All right. We know about the sort of what now we call Halloween, but the Celtic tradition was called the Samhain. We know about the Halloween traditions. So embedded within existing traditions that many people in a culture will recognize, there are these deeper links that most Wiccans and witches will look at. So here, you don't need me to explain too much, but you have the quarter days, which are the solstices and the equinoxes. That's Yule and Litha, and Ostara and Mabon. That's the solstices, Yule, June and December, and the equinoxes. So those are the 4 quarter days. And then we have these cross quarter days, which are the 1st of November, 1st of May. And actually, in many ways, the 1st of November represents the start of winter, the dark half of the year, and the 1st of May, from then around to Samhain, that represents the light half of the year. And we have the Imbolg and Lunasa. Imbolg is really the first showings of life returning after the darkness of winter, and Lunasa is the harvest time. Yeah, so harvest is the sort of first harvest October, second harvest around about September time. So around this 8 stations, 8 phases of the year, you can consider what's going on in nature at those times, which defines the season or the part of the wheel you're on. And it doesn't take a lot to imagine that this is a really good way to look at your calendar for the year, what's going on in nature and within you. Again, we can all go through our own winters. It doesn't have to be linked to December, but our own periods of darkness, in the same way we can go through our own periods of light. So this isn't just an eightfold wheel of the year in terms of the calendar, it's an eightfold journey through our own self and self-discovery. There's a lot to talk about now, but I'm sure with a bit of thought you can see where that works. Anybody who's into the tarot, you can actually lay the tarot out as these 8 spaces and ask the question is, what's in the darkness? What's the springtime? What am I birthing, giving birth to? When do I celebrate? You know, this, that, and the other. And you can link it to the wheel. Again, that's going back to the tarot. But one of the things I find really interesting is, although all of these festivals exist within the folk calendar, certainly of Britain, and or Great Britain, and probably of some of Europe, they didn't necessarily exist for at all time in this wheel. Many people suggest that the wheel that we're presented with here was a creation of the first Wiccans who started to try and formalize some of these ideas. For example, we know that in Ireland, Lunasa was a festival. You may have seen the film Dancing at Lunasa. Yeah. We also know that Samhain, Halloween, was an important Celtic fire festival. We also know that Beltane was an important Celtic fire festival. Ostara is an interesting one because it's often linked to the goddess of fertility, Ostara, and there are lots of scholarly questions about whether Ostara actually existed as a goddess that was worshipped or actually was a recent invention. One of the things you might like to do is make a copy of this wheel or find a copy of it. And one of the things that I did when I was doing my Druid training, actually, was I went through each of these phases and wrote down what I was observing in my area. So Imbolc, I looked out the window and I started to see what was growing, what was happening, what was I listening to, what animals were around, what was going on. And then in Ostara, I could do the same. So I have an inbuilt set of associations for each of these 8 stages of the year, which at the time were linked to where I lived. Okay. And they had, these stages of the year had things on like, you know, foxes mewing or foxes rutting or badgers mating or whatever, because that was happening in my area when I was first doing this. Now I would go back and look at that again for where I'm living now, because the thing about these systems is they're not static, although they appear to be. They're actually quite fluid. And with our seasons changing, who knows how this wheel has to turn now. However, each of these 8 festivals will have had a series of rituals or celebrations that go alongside them. And part of the Wiccan training was to know what you'd be doing at each of these festivals. They're very, very straightforward. In fact, some of them will echo what we know of the Christian festivals, the harvest, the seed planting, the first harvest, the fruit harvest, all that kind of stuff. But again, that's for you to play with later. The other thing that's worth reflecting on, and this is pretty common across most Wicca, is that they have a certain number of tools that will be used and called upon in their rituals. Now, I could spend the whole evening just talking about this, but I'd like to clear 1 or 2 things up. If, as a Wiccan or a witch, they were laying out an altar, they would have some or all of these things on the table. They would have an idol or a representation of the god, the horned god, and they'll have a representation of the goddess. Some places would just have 2 candles, either both white or a green and a red one, because these are the colours associated with the gods. They would have a chalice for drinking from, because you have libations of wine or apple juice or whatever. We'll have a dish that had cakes on. You can actually almost see that the Catholicism that could come into this. And interestingly, a lot of people who've been formally trained in one of the initiatory traditions, if they move away from Wicca, for whatever reason, they actually find it very comfortable to join the Roman Catholics, who actually they can recognize many of these kind of symbols within their traditions. I won't go into all of these things. Incense is obviously interesting. The athame, or the knife is not for killing things. The knife is for, well, it's for cutting and pointing. Okay, and we'll talk about how they might use that in a moment. In the Gardnerian tradition and Alexandrian traditions of witchcraft, there'd be a black-handled knife and a white-handled knife. And the black-handled knife, black-handled athame, would be used for the pointing stuff, and the white-handled knife would be used for carving symbols or talismans or shaping wood for used in ritual. A wand, well, a wand is exactly what it is. A wand is a pointing device, but a wand has a lot of symbolism in it, in the sense that it's an extension of the hand, and it's a way of directing energy or power. The water and the salt, well, they're there because they're part of a purification. Putting the salt into the water gives you a kind of a blessed water. And lastly, one of the most widely used symbols, but often misunderstood symbols, is the pentacle, which is the five-pointed star. Five-pointed star is really interesting. Without going into too many distractions here, again, in one of our early moots that's recorded, you can get access to, I talk a lot about the 4, the 5, and the 6-pointed star, and the 8-pointed star, which you can actually look at the symbolism of. But basically, one way to think about that 5-pointed star is the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, water, and the one on the top pointing upwards is spirit. So that one of the ways of looking at the way that symbol, what that symbol stands for, is the integration of the 4 material elements with spirit. And that's your own spiritual self as well as your own elemental self. In all the Hammer horror movies, you'll see the pentacle turned upside down with 2 bits sticking at the head, and that's meant to be the symbol of the devil. Rubbish. In Wiccan traditions, the upside down pentacle is actually a symbol of 2nd degree initiation. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the third symbol that's not on there, but if you imagine the pentacle as it's drawn there with another triangle on top of that one that's pointing upwards, that's a symbol of 3rd degree initiation. First and second ones are really easy. The 1st degree symbol, the pentacle that way up, actually is about spirit over matter. And the work here is about allowing the spirit to inform you over matter. But as we have a number of different forces within us, to understand spirit over matter, you need to understand matter over spirit, which is the reversed pentagram. The upside down one that people say is the devil's horns. Not at all, it's misunderstanding. But those are the kind of items that you might find on a particular witchy table. If you go into any house of a witch and you know they're practicing, you may see these things scattered around the house, not giving any particular attention to them, but they're there for them to use. On the bell, actually, again, is a sign of clarity, a sign of actually ringing in changes. So that's the kind of tools of the craft. And it can be a brief introduction, but the symbolism is very, very rich within each of these things. Okay. In a ritual, what most witches will do is follow this simple guideline. There will be a purification of the sacred space and the participants. In some places, that will be sprinkling of the water, salt and water mix. Other places, it will be waving incense around them, like the censers in a church. And the idea is that the space becomes special if you put the effort in to make it so. And the particular participants also become cleansed and special before they start their work. Then a circle is cast. And that's where the dagger, the athame, comes in. The idea of creating a circle by your gestures drawing around the people that are there. It's the magic circle. It's the kind of witch's circle. It's the circle of protection, which often exists as in the imagination, doesn't have to be drawn out physically anywhere, although it's often marked by 4 candles for the 4 quarters or the 4 elements, which is the next bit. You call to the elements. Now, if you've seen the film The Craft, the original one, you've seen them do that. You know, I call upon the spirits of the water to each of the 4 quarters, the 4 elements, has a different set of associations, and that's the calling of the elements, and it's bringing those energies, if you like, to the circle. The cone of power is the next step in a ritual, and that's really working to make that sacred space energetic, that feels that something right is going on, in the same way that in a church the priest will actually bless the people, say a few prayers, and make the space receptive for whatever they're going to do there. One way of thinking of the cone of power really is that it is if the circle represents a circumference of a 3-dimensional structure that goes up and down. So one way to think of the circle is that it's a sphere, okay, and you're only marking where it intersects the ground. But the cone of power is the power you draw from and within that sphere to make your magic work. The next step is usually drawing down the gods. Now, drawing down the gods, it's the idea that whatever your energy you want to work with, you will find the appropriate god reference point or goddess reference point to bring them into your circle. You're going to work in participation with the elemental forces that you understand. Again, you can probably find, if you go to church, you can probably find parallels to each of these. You know, drawing down the gods could be, may the power of the Lord protect you, may Jesus protect you. Come into this group now and speak to us. Once you've done all that, that's when the work of the group or the ritual starts. That's when spell casting starts. Spell casting, again, is something that I think is often misunderstood by people outside of magic. Spell casting is not simply about chanting a few words without any kind of meaning or reference. Spell casting is about working with intent and using symbolic representations of that intent to make the thing happen. It's actually, from a psychological perspective, it's about bringing your mind in alignment with your goals, and you're making those goals physical. The next step in a meeting might be initiations, if they're relevant, or something called the Great Rite. Now, the Great Rite is another totally misunderstood idea. The newspapers love talking about the Great Rite because it implies sex, ritual sex. Well, in some places it may mean that, but in most cases there is a symbolic rite of bringing together the male and the female principles. The male principle is often represented by the athame, the dagger, and the female principle is often represented by the chalice. So the Great Rite is a symbolic act of uniting the Grail and the chalice. And actually, when it's done with intent, and this, that simply bringing those two objects together, when it's done with intent and clarity, it's quite a powerful moment of action. Yeah. And of course, what you do, you have your wines, your cake, your chanting, your dancing, and your games, because celebration is an important part of this religious practice. And then you say goodbye to the gods, goodbye to the 4 quarters, and goodbye to the people. And that's your basic outline of a ritual. This can work as a group, normally called a coven, or as an individual when you do this yourself, as a solo worker. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that many people think that you have to have a whole group of people dancing and singing and chanting and casting circles to do any good. But I actually think that this process as a meditational process is as powerful for the individual as it is for the group. And in fact, if it's for the individual or for the individual who's being guided, this can be quite an enlightening experience. It's echoed in the Christian church by the sacraments, by communion. It's the same kind of echoing. And the Christians who find this difficult, is they don't make that connection. Okay. So, how did all this stuff come about? So, to finish, and I'm only going to introduce the idea. I wanted to get you to think about this stuff. I want to talk you through some of the key people that have had contributed to what we now know as Wicca. And there'll be other people I've missed, I know, but these are the people that I read. I was going to say studiously, I don't know if that's the right word. When I first got into this stuff when I was a teenager, I read these people a lot. And therefore, some of my thinking is inspired by their thinking, and some of my thinking has moved on from where they were. Not that I'm right, just that that's what happens. So James Fraser is an important name in the whole area of magic. He was, again, in the 1800s, there was a lot going on spiritually. There were new movements being developed. The New Thought movement, which was developing in the 1800s. Spiritualism was developed in the 1800s. Certain aspects of Christianity, I believe, Jehovah's Witnesses, 1800s. There was a lot because people were looking for something. They were looking for something outside of the Industrial Revolution they're experiencing, which seemed to distance themselves from the spiritual nature of things. So James Fraser's book that's worth reading is called The Golden Bough. It's a long book. It's in 4 parts. The answer is holly, mistletoe, but The Golden Bough is really a book about our relationship to life and to the spiritual aspects of life. How we feel about death, how humanity has seemed to overcome death, and the fact that there is a mystical element which seems to go through all human cultures. And the book, The Golden Bough, is divided into 4 sections. The second section is about the stories where gods were murdered, tortured, enslaved, which focuses on that birth, death, and rebirth idea. You've only got to take myth of Osiris, for example. Now, Osiris was cut up, his body was scattered across the world, and it took Osiris to bring his body pieces back together again. The third book is actually where looking at the gods and the way we sacrifice people, creating scapegoats quite literally in order to bring about change. And the last part of the book looks at how we connect to the afterlife. It's a fascinating book. In retrospect, you can question the scholarship of the book and the assumptions made within it, but it is still a good read. And it was this book that inspired some of the modern Wiccans to start to rethink spiritual traditions. Let me get this lady, Margaret Murray, again, 1800s. Margaret Murray was an anthropologist of sorts, and her interest was belief systems across the world, and she wrote a book called The Witch Cult in Western Europe. Again, a book you can get hold of very easily, well worth a read. And the key idea of that book is that she had what was called the witch cult hypothesis, and where she tried to link the witch trials of the 1600s, whatever, as an attempt to suppress a country or pagan religion that survived Christianity. And she made this assumption that these people that were actually executed were followers of a religion, a formalized religion that she called the witch cult. And it had the horned god of fertility, and the Christians persecuted them because that was the devil, worshiping the devil. Now, there's a big problem with this book. She was scholarly, but again, it's very easy in retrospect to see where assumptions are made. Most modern researchers think that her witch cult hypothesis is largely discredited. It doesn't work. What does come from the book are the examples that she uses of where practices were known by different peoples in different pagan times. And the thing was that she just pulled them together to make the statement that they were organized and structured in a way that they actually weren't. I'll give you some ideas to where to look out for her. But again, this was bubbling around the time that people were looking for alternative ways of living and being. And her book, to start with, is quite influential in saying, look, I told you, we're all part of an ancient tradition. It's got to be ancient because she talks about it as being a witch cult that predates the modern era. It was quite a comforting myth, not now held up by anthropologists. Now, the next guy that needs to come into the mix is this gentleman here that many of you will have heard of. And his name, this guy is one of these names that when you mention him, he actually always produces some kind of emotional reaction in people. He's a bit like Marmite, right? You mention Aleister Crowley, they go, ooh, watch him. Ooh. Actually, if you read Aleister Crowley, you can see he declined into insanity and drug abuse, whatever. But actually, his scholarship was quite amazing. One of his key works was Magic in Theory and Practice, which is one of the earliest books I read, really. And I didn't understand it. I've got to be honest, when I first read it, I thought, what? Because he talks about things in a way that if you take them seriously, they lead you to a particular conclusion, which is wrong. You have to look at what's the subtext of what's being said. But basically, he started to define what magic was, and he used K to differentiate it from the conjuring magicians. And he basically says the art and science of causing change in conformity with will. And it's the aim of all religions, he believed. And if you think about it, that's pretty close statement. You go to church and you pray. What are you praying for? You're praying to have a change in your life situation, and you're willing that change. So basically this idea that magic is a real thing is important. There's a wonderful story about Aleister Crowley that he was walking across the Cornish landscape with one of his several sons called Amado, who may or may not have been his son, but who claims to be his son, or claimed to be his son. And they're walking on the cliff top, and the son saw a slow worm or something and wanted to stamp it. And Crowley said, no, don't do that yet. Name it. And so he got Amado to give the thing a name, and then said, now you've named it, you have power over it. If you want to kill it, you can. And the lad chose not to, because having the power over something was quite a big thing. Okay. And he made his son realize that actually it's not about destruction, it's about understanding. And that we give labels to things in order to understand them. Quite a nice lesson. Crowley goes a step further, though, and he actually says that every intentional act is a magic act. Every intentional act is a magic act. So I'll just pause a sec. Yeah. Sorry, yes, I was just, oops. So I just got to close something down here. My fault, I opened it and I shouldn't have done. There we go. So I go back. Yes. Every intentional act is a magic act. And I think that's worth thinking about. If you do something with intention and focus and purpose, it's magic. So even picking a glass up to drink some water is a magical act. Anyway, Crowley brought the idea of magic and much, much more to the table. He was versed in Kabbalah, he was versed in tarot, he was versed in loads of alchemical teachings. So he brought a lot to the table. So the next guy that's worth thinking about is Gerald Gardner. He really can be credited with starting this whole Wiccan thing. Now, I know certain witches won't like that, but I think that chronologically it was Gardner that synthesized everything and brought it together. He was well traveled. He worked in the civil service. He was interested in all things, particularly sociological and anthropological, and he read Margaret Murray's book. And he started to notice that these practices could form a series of traditions, a series of new meanings or relevant meanings for today, which gave him his tradition to work from. He claims that he was initiated into the craft by a relative called old Dorothy Clutterbuck. It is very much questionable whether that really happened. However, he started a coven, and this was an influential coven. It's called the Bricket Wood Coven, and he brought loads of people together to talk about and share ideas of what became modern Wicca. It kind of helped him and his purposes that he was also a practicing nudist, so it became common for witches' meetings to be nude or sky-clad, as it was called. But Gardner had also been involved in the Golden Dawn. That's Crowley's mob. He'd been involved in Rosicrucianism, yeah, and he was well versed in other mystical arts. So he created this hodgepodge of Wicca, which was again probably to do away with the intellectual stuff and come more to being grounded in the earth-based traditions. His famous book is Witchcraft Today, which is well worth a read, and it says that it's an anthropological account of witchcraft survivals and contains statements about what witches do and believe. He took a lot of his early stuff from Margaret Murray's work and he pieced together a tradition. So it's really important to think about that. Next guy that's really interesting is a guy called Cecil Williamson, well known in Cornwall because of the Witchcraft Museum that he brought down from Cornwall. He kind of knew Gerald Gardner. They kind of worked together for a while, but then they fell out. Cecil Williamson is an interesting character. And I've got to be, I don't want to diss the guy because he did a lot, brought the Witchcraft Museum to Cornwall. He populated it, but I think he enjoyed the theatre of witchcraft. And if you went to the museum as Cecil designed it before it was revamped, it was quite dark, okay? It featured sort of mannequins of naked women over altars and things. However, he was an interesting character. He was a screenwriter, editor, film director, and very influential in neo-paganism, and called himself a warlock. He claimed to be a founder of the Witchcraft Research Centre, which was part of MI6's war against Nazi Germany, and he also founded the Witchcraft Museum, which was initially in the Isle of Man. Now, this MI6 Witchcraft Research Centre, I'm not so sure about it. There is this wonderful bit of theory that Aleister Crowley, and as he says himself, were involved in a kind of clandestine organization of occultists that were working against Hitler. Now, there's a possibility that that's true because, as we know, Himmler particularly was an occult nut, and Hitler was giving Himmler the opportunity of creating a sort of mystique around the Nazi movement. And it's also interesting to note that, that James Bond author Ian Fleming, who was a member of MI6, was potentially also involved in this, shall we say, propaganda about English witches and magicians facing Nazi witches and magicians. The truth of that is we'll never know. However, the Witchcraft Research Centre could refer to the Witchcraft Research Association, which was founded in 1964, and it had Gerald Gardner, Robert Cochrane, Sybil Leek, Charles Connor, and Raymond Howard. Names won't bother with too much, except that they were trying to piece together all the traditions of the surviving so-called witch cult, which we know now didn't exist. So there was a Witchcraft Research Association, but not associated with MI6. Another person that's important, a lady called Sybil Leek. Again, if you can read a book, she wrote a book called Diary of a Witch, which spoke to her about her witchcraft activities and what she was doing. And incidentally, these are the books I actually read way back to sort of get an insight what was going on. At the time, she was dubbed the most famous witch in Britain. And she spoke to, in a book about her belief in witchcraft. She argued with lots of people, particularly Gardner. She disapproved of nudity and was against the use of drugs. And therefore, she was at odds with most other witches. And she didn't believe in cursing. Actually, I'm not sure many other witches would curse, but no. But she took up environmental causes. So again, we see this link with the land. I'll move quite quickly now. Important lady, Doreen Valiente. I've got a bit of a hero worship with Doreen Valiente, simply because her first book was Where Witchcraft Lives, which was an account of her discovery of witchcraft, but she worked with Gardner's Bricketwood Coven, and she was instrumental in piecing together the material that formed the Book of Shadows, the Gardner Book of Shadows, which was the Book of Magic. She wrote so much. She was a poet, she was an author, she was well versed in folklore, particularly in the own county of Sussex. She wrote most of the ritual and poetic content of Gardnerian Wicca. By this stage, Gerald Gardner had established a group of Wicca called Gardnerian Wicca, and she later collaborated with the Farrars on their work and in publishing the Gardnerian Book of Shadows. We'll put that later. But one of the things that most Wiccans will know is this 8-word phrase, 8 words the reckon we'd fulfill, and arm ye none, do what they will. And that's kind of the tagline that most Wiccans will follow. An important character now, a guy called Alex Saunders, often called the working class witch. He actually started as a spiritualist medium and was interested in that kind of things. And he got drawn into studying aspects of Golden Dawn and Metacism, and then eventually hit upon the Gardnerian Wicca. And cut a long story short, he developed his own approach to Wicca based upon Alexandria, Greek, Greek gods and goddesses, and it became known as the Alexandrian movement. In 1970, now Alex Saunders was a publicity magnate. We already mentioned this kind of thing. He got more press coverage than Gerald Gardner. He was very astute at hitting the newspaper headlines, promoting his particular brand of Wicca, which appealed to sort of the post-hippies and that kind of people. He produced an album released by NM Records called A Witch is Born, which was a recording of the initiation of a particular member of his coven, who I believe became Janet Farrar. The album you can find online and listen if you want to, but the thing about it is he popularized it and took a lot of the academic stigma out of it and developed a group of people that were trained in his tradition, which was the Alexandrian tradition, which is part of the tradition I trained in initially. He was more accessible, but he was a publicity-hungry guy. His wife, Maxine Saunders, I was lucky enough to meet Pagan Federation and a couple of times. She's still alive now. She, at the same time, she married Alex, and she wrote a book called Witch Queen, which was all about her work with Alex. They divorced shortly afterwards, and Maxine went her own way. And it was interesting to note that when speaking to her and hearing her speak, she will acknowledge this part of her magical past, but she would refer to herself now as an occultist, or at least that's what I've heard herself referred to, not as a witch, as an occultist, which suggests that she's broadened out from the simple practice of witchcraft, but she still is quite an influential speaker and an influential person. Stuart Farrar, important name to know, died in 2000. Stuart Farrar, his first book really was What Witches Do. It was a modern coven revealed. Stuart was an author, a playwright, wrote television series. He got interested as a journalist in witches, mostly through seeing Alexander Saunders' publicity, and went along and found out what it was about, got so involved with what it was about that he became initiated himself and became a witch. His first book, What Witches Do, well worth a read. It's really a behind-the-scenes description of what witches are doing, talks about their fundamental beliefs, talks about the Esbats, which are meetings, and Sabbats, which are the 8 festivals, talks about hand-fasting ceremonies and marriages. And he talks about the way witches would use psychic powers and for healing and protection and spell work. I really enjoyed this book when I've read it, and I read it again quite recently. And it's just interesting how he writes and pulls it in. But during his initiations, he met this lady here, Janet Farrar, and together they wrote The Witch's Way, which is probably one of the first major textbooks on the rituals and rites and beliefs of a modern witchcraft. Now, Janet, it's against her life. I've been lucky enough to spend some time with Janet. She's a fascinating lady. She's a fascinating lady. I can't say more than that. She still has this kind of, I don't know, there's something about her that, something about her. Her current partner, Gavin Bone, they both work in Ireland now, and they run covens. But when they came to write Witch's Way, The Way of Witchcraft, they decided to publish in more detail exactly how a coven would work and what witches believe. It's a great book. And in fact, anything by Janet and Stuart Farrar is worth reading. They wrote The Witch's Bible, they wrote The Witch's God, The Witch's Goddess. They're all great books because they talk about a specific tradition and it's their take on it. An important person, a lady called Margot Adler, unfortunately died a bit young. She wrote a book called Drawing Down the Moon. And what's so important about this book is it starts to shift the Wiccan movement from a male-dominated tradition and bringing in more levels of feminism. Great book. And she took it from an American standpoint, and she started to outline what we could call Dianic practice, which is Wicca that is mostly all females. Fascinating. Raymond Buckland, an English guy initiated by Joel Gardner, moved to the States and published The Complete Witchcraft, probably the best known book on complete book of witchcraft, with text, step-by-step courses. It's a course book, a manual for witchcraft, basically. If you've seen it, if you've not read it, worth a read. It's even got exam questions at the end of the book. It's written like a textbook, and it's really well written. Starhawk, an important member of this group, worth reading. 1961, she was a Gardnerian, I think, which she may have been Alexandrian, I can't remember. But she started to focus on the feminine movement, wrote a book called The Spiral Dance, and started to take all the philosophy and witchcraft and looking them together to understand the goddess tradition in a more detailed way. It's brilliant. The Spiral Dance is a brilliant book. She is a very powerful speaker, and her book really resonates with the feminist movement. So it's moving Wicca into this area away from the sort of male domination. Nearly there. This guy, Scott Cunningham, died incredibly young. Wrote a book called Wicca for the Solo Practitioner. And in this book, he outlines a way of training yourself in Wicca and witchcraft, and the fact that it can be a magical spiritual path on your own. You don't need a coven, you don't need a group. I love Scott Cunningham's writings. He has done an incredible amount of work on actually making Wicca accessible. If you're a member of the School of Mystery Magic, I've got a video of Scott Cunningham on there teaching herbalism. Well worth a look. And then the last guy I'm really going to mention that's worth talking about is a guy called Isaac Bonowitz. Died fairly recently. Fascinating guy. The Witchcraft book is Essential Guide to Witchcraft and Wicca, where it's an encyclopedia of the history of Wicca and witchcraft. If that intellectual stuff grabs you, read this book. Isaac Bonowitz has written so many other books as well. He's written a book on Druidry. He's written a book on essential magical practice, which is absolutely brilliant. So he is a guy that, if you want to follow this up, well worth reading, Isaac Bonowitz. And I'm nearly finished because I've gone on too long now. Other great people to read: Ronald Hutton, our own Professor Ronald Hutton. What a man. He is the guy to read if you want to look at the academic stuff behind the fairy tale stuff that most writers write. He is a historian, but he actually specializes in I don't know what he specializes in, let's call it the Western occult tradition. If you ever get a chance to hear him speak, he is absolutely brilliant. I've been lucky enough to hear him speak several times at some of the Pagan Federation years ago, but he is great, and his books are fantastic. He himself doesn't explicitly say so, but I'm fully aware that he attends pagan festivals, pagan meetings, and his books are worth reading. Another guy that's worth looking at is Christopher Penczak, a youngish writer, done a hell of a lot of work on restating magic and Wicca for the solo performer. Solo practitioner. Sorry, hiccups. Dion Fortune is well worth a read. Dion Fortune wrote a load of books. Most of them, to start with, were stories. But inside the stories are the occult rituals that she was practicing, and she wrote them as novels because it was safer for her to do so rather than producing a book on magic. And lastly, Robert Cochrane, interesting guy, developed the 1914 group, who were another Gardnerian-based coven that was a splinter group. So what I've tried to do, I think, today is give you a kind of view about what witches believe, and then a connecting to the historical parts where hopefully you can chase up and do some reading and research on your own. And if you're interested, we used to run at the school a 13-moon course on the craft. We've been in the process of converting it to an online course. And, that's a 13-month course covering the basis of the way that both my partner and I think of Wicca at the moment. It should be clear by the things I've been talking about. Don't call myself a Wiccan as such, although I'm interested in the magical tradition. But nevertheless, if you're interested, let me know. It'll be available online soon as a course with 13 texts and 13 books covering the stuff. You can also already access the books on the festivals because they're part of the group. But if you're interested, let me know and we'll go from there. I'll shut up. I shall stop recording, and we can have a